Joining us now on the program, he is a journalism professor at Oakland University. Garry Gilbert joins us on the Oakland County MegaCast. Professor, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
So how are you? How have you been during all of this?
These are extraordinary times in which we live, aren't they, Tyler?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Unprecedented times, to say the very least. So Oakland had held classes during most of the pandemic as it moved forward. How did your teachings and the teachings of the journalism department maybe be modified or be varied in some ways to incorporate the times that we're in teaching these up-and-coming reporters to be quality journalists?
That's a great question. We're working with our young people, our students, to do exactly what professional journalists are doing today, which is learning to do their stories remotely, perhaps without a safety net, learning how to conduct interviews and write profiles and to do their research and to do their observation from home rather than from a brick and mortar office somewhere. So these are extraordinary times, as I mentioned. But I think our students are up to the challenge, and they are eagerly embracing the new technology that allows them to work to do their classroom work from home, and to do, for instance, I'm the advisor for the campus newspaper, the Oakland Post, and our students there are learning how to put out a digital newspaper while working from their bedroom.
Very, very interesting. Garry Gilbert, journalism professor at Oakland University, with us on the Oakland County MegaCast. It's crazy to think that in a general election year, something else could become the story of the year. And of course, COVID-19 is the story of the year. Coverage has been highly politicized on many outlets based on what the news folks are looking at. What are your thoughts on how the media has covered the pandemic? Has it been effective? Has it been too polarized?
Great question. Let's try it from this angle. Right now, the media are being challenged to cover two extraordinary stories. The COVID-19 pandemic has been persistent. Usually these types of stories, we have a beginning, we have a crisis, and then we have a quick resolution. That has not been the case with the pandemic, with the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, the news media are being challenged to cover another unusual story, and that is the protests that have started around the nation and are continuing in the wake of the death of George Floyd at the knee of a Minneapolis police officer. Covering two extraordinary stories like this at the same time, that doesn't happen very often in the news cycle, in my experience, unless we're talking about a world war and a Great Depression being at the same time. This is at the same time that the news organizations are being challenged to cover these two major stories, they are also facing financial pressure as a result of advertisers with the pandemic in the news constantly are putting their hands on their wallets and holding back on their advertising spending. As you know, for more than 150 years in this country, journalism was subsidized by advertising. That system doesn't work the way it did anymore. So we really have three unusual things occurring here. Two major stories that are demanding attention, financial pressure on the news media that are trying to cover these stories, and then three, we have President Trump and other conservative leaders around the world who are demeaning the news industry, telling the audience telling their supporters and their loyalists that journalists can't be trusted, that any stories that are critical of the White House or the administration must therefore be fake news. So this is really an unusual time, a challenging time to be talking about journalism and its role in our political culture.
Garry Gilbert with us. He is a journalism professor at Oakland University, discussing the state of our news and our news reporting. Our newspapers, Garry, and our local television, our community television outlets really at this point are critical to stories getting the information out, getting a full scope of that information to the public. But then you go to the national level, and you want to learn the story, but they want to teach you the story and they want you to learn, but they also are trying to put people in the seats, as you've mentioned, with advertising dollars. And so they tend to lean one way or lean the other way and convince the viewership on their outlet that this is the angle of the story that's correct, the other one is wrong, and there is no in between. Is that are we going in a dangerous direction on the national news level with having such polarization on these major networks?
That's an interesting observation, Tyler. Now, I would say that there's Pew Research that just came out yesterday, and if you're familiar with the Pew Research organization, it is a nonpartisan, nonprofit fact tank that did some surveying during the course of the summer and published the results yesterday. And those results show that 71% of Americans who responded to the poll said that news organizations are doing an excellent or a very good job of covering the pandemic. Though those numbers are rewarding. Journalists should feel pretty good about numbers that say that 71% of the public thinks that we're doing a good or a very good job at covering the pandemic. You asked the question, though, about the polarization that we see as a result. Now, it's interesting that the numbers for the evening news programs, NBC, CBS, ABC, those numbers are higher than they have been in years. In fact, for a brief period of time this summer, ABC News, World News Tonight, became the #1 rated program on television. That's really good to see. People are paying attention. Ratings are up for cable news. Ratings are up for local news. And you mentioned, Tyler, the role of the local news organizations in covering this story. And in fact, the Pew Research shows that local news organizations, meaning local television, local radio, local news websites, actually get higher ratings for their believability, for their credibility, than do the national news programs. And of course, Fox News has its loyal viewers, CNN, MSNBC have their loyal viewers, but they get slightly lower ratings for their credibility and their believability.
Garry Gilbert with us, the journalism professor at Oakland University, talking to us about the state of our news in the United States. And this all didn't just suddenly happen, Garry, that the polarization, particularly in cable news is what I'm speaking of, the national news on more local and syndicated stations tends to be a little bit more centric. But the polarization generally in the United States and definitely in our cable news, it didn't all of a sudden happen. What are some of the causes in your beliefs and from what your knowledge of the journalism industry is? What is some of the justifications or reasons for how this all developed to where we're at right now?
Well, Tyler, people tend to view the news media outlets that support their worldview. That means if you're a conservative politically, if you're a supporter of President Trump, you are more likely to tune in to Fox News because their reporting, and particularly the opinion shows, tend to support the view that you already hold. We like to have that sense of affirmation. Okay, these reporters, these journalists see the world in the same way that I do. If you're a liberal or you consider yourself to be a Democrat, you are more likely to watch a program like MSNBC or Rachel Maddow because the stories that they're going to report feed you, shape you, reflect, mirror how you already feel about the world. Now, editors at the New York Times, editors at the Washington Post certainly understand that their audience skews in a liberal direction. So they're going to try to give you all the news that they think that you need, but they're going to shape that news to keep their audience. That means that this partisan, that we're sort of in these, you've heard this expression that we're in our silos, that we're in our information bubbles. In my classes, and also some speaking events that I do, I try to encourage people to move outside, to get outside of their information bubble, to challenge themselves, to read widely. The Rabbi Sherwin Wine, who was a controversial, charismatic figure in this market for a long time, used to say, Why would I spend my time reading the views of somebody with whom I already agree? And what he meant was that we should challenge ourselves. We should, if you consider yourself to be a liberal or a Democrat, you need to watch Fox News once in a while to see how people on the right are presenting their argument. If you're a conservative, if you consider yourself a Republican, you should be occasionally watching CNN, MSNBC, reading the New York Times in order to see how the left is thinking. It doesn't help at all if you insulate yourself and hang out only with reporters and journalists and with members of the audience who see the world the same way that you do.
With the decline of newspapers and investigative journalism, what do you see the future of journalism being, and what advice are you giving to students that want to go into this industry?
Great question. 20 years ago, I used to be able to tell my students, if you do well in my classes, I will be able to find you a job, and it will pay you well enough that you can live a comfortable lifestyle. I can get you a job at a newspaper in Detroit or in Chicago or in New York. I can't promise that anymore, of course. So our students are learning to be creative and enterprising and entrepreneurial. I am a product of the newspaper industry. I spent more than 30 years working in that industry. I could see the handwriting on the wall in around 2006, 2007. That's when I decided to go into teaching full time. My timing was pretty good. I still have a lot of friends who work in the newspaper industry. Now, that said, I am not nostalgic about the decline of print newspapers. We have today the best system for the collection and delivery of information that's been invented so far. The digital news environment is the best system developed so far. I'm excited to see where it's going. The problem, of course, is how do we pay journalists? How do we make journalism a worthwhile living? How do we, the students that I have who want careers in journalism, how are they going to get paid? That's the major question. Where we have this experiment that's going on in this country right now where information is expected to be free, that I should be able to log into a website and get all of the news that I need, and I shouldn't have to pay for it. That experiment's been going on for 20 years, and that it needs to change. If news organizations have quality, proprietary content that they can deliver to the audience, they should be able to charge for it, and the audience should be willing to pay for it.
Garry Gilbert with us. He's a journalism professor at Oakland University. Social media professor is also critical in today's age to news delivery, and for better and for worse. It's news reporters and news organizations that are delivering news as it happens, as it breaks, as it develops through social media immediately to the consumer before sometimes it even gets to television or to radio or to other outlets. But you also, on the other side, have the general public that are being, in some way, for lack of better terms, vigilante reporters that are going out and reporting information that may not entirely be true. Do we have a dangerous precedent in the current social media landscape in terms of reporting news, or is this going to be something that in the future is going to help coverage of the news be more accurate and be more expedient and expose more of these truths that are hidden to the public that the people need to know?
Boy, an argument can be made that we're going through the first true social media infodemic, if you will. The way information spreads today through social media without being verified, without being fact-checked, is truly concerning. Back in the 1950s, Ed Murrow, the father of broadcast journalism, said he was worried about the fact that a falsehood could go around the world at such speed while the truth was still trying to get its pants on. And he was talking about television in the 50s. Today, as you know, in a viral moment, news can reach billions of people without any filter on whether it's accurate, whether it's true. And in fact, we know that there are people on using social media to deliberately distort information. Misinformation is one thing. Disinformation is truly even more dangerous. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, the administrations of those platforms have attempted this summer to try to put some restrictions on the amount of false information that is circulating on their platforms, but so far it doesn't appear to have been very effective. By the way, there is research that shows that Americans who get their news primarily through social media tend to be less well informed than those who use local television news, local news websites, or the national news organizations.
Professor Garry Gilbert from the Journalism Department at Oakland University with us on the Oakland County MegaCast. Looking into the future, Garry, is there other signs of hope for journalism as an art, as a science, as a craft, as an important industry in every society on planet Earth, that we're going to have more of that sense of the glory days, so to speak, where you saw your journalist on TV, where you heard the journalist on the radio, where you read them in the paper, and you could trust that the information you're getting is solid? And that also incorporates those that are on social media reporting news as well. Do we have signs of hope for the future that this polarization and this misinformation is not going to be this major problem for long, and eventually we are going to get through this infodemic, as you said?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am encouraged, and certainly, I have 100 students at Oakland University who are majoring in journalism. I want them to be able to graduate and find good jobs. I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing this summer as people, as we are grappling with these two major stories, the pandemic and the mass protest across the country in support of Black Lives Matter. I'm encouraged by the fact that ratings are up for television news, that ratings are up for local news programs, that radio news is getting more listeners, that digital news platforms are getting more subscribers. This is certainly the fact that there are important stories and that the audience is turning to news organizations for information about those stories has to be encouraging. What I worry about, as I just tried to explain, is how will media charge for access to their content so that they can pay their journalists a living wage, so that we'll be able to continue to attract people into this field. I find myself at a lot of high school recruiting events and events where I'm talking to would-be college students, and they say, I'm interested in a career in journalism. What can you tell me about the career prospects? And in the background, their parents are saying, wait, I thought journalism was dying. Journalism's dying, right? How is my son or my daughter going to pay back their tuition, pay back their loans? I said, journalism's not dying. There will always be a need for information that's been researched, that's been collected through interviews, that's been collected through observation. That research, that information has been verified and then clarified. There will always be a demand for that kind of content. The question is the audience willing to pay the cup of what the price of a cup of Starbucks coffee is? $3.50. Is the audience willing to pay $3.50 a week for access to quality proprietary information?
Garry Gilbert, anything else before we let you go today?
Well, thanks for the invitation to talk about this. I do think that we're facing a real challenge, particularly on social media, in the way that the information is gathered and distributed. Again, I would encourage people to read widely, to view their news sources, to get outside their comfort zone, to occasionally listen. I think, Tyler, that we have a problem in this country, particularly on social media. We talk at each other. We don't listen to each other. And if we spent a little bit more time listening, maybe social media wouldn't be quite so toxic. the way it is today.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, Professor.
I really appreciate the invitation. I'd be happy to appear anytime.
Wonderful. We will definitely get in contact with you again very soon. Garry Gilbert, journalism professor at Oakland University.